Aloha and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about authentication and authorization on the internet. We're going to be talking about SAML, OpenID, and ZeroAuth. So before we go ahead and start that, let's open up our books and take a look here. We're in section 2.9 on authentication and authorization. We're dealing with the internet this time. So we're going to start out with security assertions markup language, which is SAML. So I'm not sure if you've dealt with things in the past that are XML based. You've probably heard of HTML. HTML is the quote unquote language that you use to build web pages, but we have something called SAML, and it's based on XML. And I'm going to pull up an XML example here. Hold on, let me put in example. And for this, we can take a look. So what you need to know about XML, you usually have a line that starts off explaining, the version, things like that. But then everything is stored in these brackets. So like bookstore is defined within bookstore, and you'll have you'll have what we call a closing bookstore tag here, which is basically the same thing with a little forward slash in front of the bookstore. So then we have book category, and that's going to go, and so you have these different things like or wait, actually book right here, category equals fiction, and then book is closed out by the slash book. So you can define attributes in here. So we've got title, author, year, price. So it uses a structure kind of like this to pass around security information. If you've not seen XML before, this is kind of what it looks like. You don't need to know a lot about XML. You don't need to know anything about XML. I just want you to know kind of what XML is. When you're sitting there trying to think, wait, what does it mean it's XML based? Just means that when they're passing credentials, it's going to be stored in a form kind of like this when it's being passed back and forth. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get back to this. So it's an XML based standard. SAML is an XML based standard for exchanging authentication and authorization information. SAML provides single sign-on for web-based applications and is commonly used by web portals. So single sign-on SSO, it's an authentication method that lets a user log into multiple systems with a single identity without having to authenticate to each system separately. And that saves you a lot of time. I used to use this when I was in state. I'd use single sign-on and I could get into a lot of different things without having to re-sign in every single time. So there's three roles in SAML. There's the principal, that's the human user. You've got an identity provider, IDP, and that's an entity that creates, manages, maintains the identity information for a principal. So that's the central location for your information. Then you've got a service provider, and that's an entity that's going to provide a service to the principal, in other words, to the user. So this is just going through and making sure you understand the language that we just defined. So SAML uses assertion statements. So SAML is used between the identity provider and the service provider. So in other words, the person that's handling your identification with the person or with the service to which you want to get something from the service provider. So when a principal, the user, requests the service provider do something for them, the service provider is going to request from the IDP, the identity provider, for that authentication authorization information. So in response to the service provider's request, the identity provider is going to send a SAML assertion to the service provider. So the SAML assertion is a digitally signed XML document like the one we just saw, but that wasn't security. That was a bookstore example, and it's gonna contain information about that principal, the user. So the three types of SAML assertions are going to be authentication statement, which says when it was authenticated last, or in the specific time at which using a specific authentication method that it was authenticated. Then you're going to have an attribute statement, or that's going to be statements about the principal that has their specific attributes and their name value pairs, kind of like what we saw before. It had book, category, things like that. And then an authorization statement that asserts that a principal is permitted to perform a specific action on a specific resource. So notice that SAML has both authentication and authorization included here. So keep that in mind. So an SP service provider makes an access control decision, meaning it decides whether to perform a principal's requested service based on the identity provider's assertion statements about the principal. Then we have the participation activity over here. You can click on this. You can see that the principal is going to say, hey, provider, I want to do something. So they're making a request of it. And then the service provider is going to request the identity provider for the principal's authentication and authorization information. And then the IDP is going to request the principal's credentials. They answer to here, and the identity provider then sends a SAML assertion about the principal's authentication and authorization to the service provider. And then based on the identity provider SAML assertion, the service provider grants or denies the principal's access request to a resource. So this is the way SAML works. And we've got some exercises here for you to do to solidify all that in your head and some answers to match them up. Then we're going to be talking about OpenID. Now, OpenID is an open standard protocol for decentralized authentication. Authentication only here. We're not talking about authorization. So it's going to be used for its open standard protocol. It's not a proprietary thing here. And OpenID is going to allow a user to log into multiple websites without the need to have login credentials for each of the websites. So OpenID allows a client, which in this case is the website or the application, to verify the identity of the user without actually having to manage the user's credentials. So it's the way that you're able to go to a website and log in using your Facebook credentials or your Google credentials or something like that. So OpenID does not rely on a central authority for user authentication. It could be one of multiple places. It could, when you're presented with a list of like, hey, do you want to log in with Google, log in with Facebook, things like that. So an open identity provider, an open IDP, is a website that manages a user's identity information. So for example, Google and Facebook are OpenID IDPs, the identity providers. On the other end of it, you've got the OpenID Acceptor, or what we call the relying party, the RP. And that's a website that accepts OpenID authentication. So a user creates an account with an OpenID IDP, and the user and the account to sign into an OpenID Acceptor. So an OpenID Acceptor redirects the user's authentication request to the OpenID identity provider that manages the user's identity information. So OpenID IDP, the identity provider, confirms the user's identity to the OpenID Acceptor. So OpenID does not mandate a specific authentication method by which an OpenID identity provider can authenticate a user. So the OpenID identity provider can use any type of authentication method they want. So they can use legacy passwords, smart cards, biometrics, just to name a few. So they're not putting restrictions on how they actually do that identification there, the authentication. So this is what it looks like. You've probably seen this many times. Log in with Google, log in with GitHub, log in with Facebook, things like that. So this is how that works in practice. Then you can go ahead and match up your terms here. And again, kind of go ahead and solidify in your head what these different things are. Then we get to zero auth. So zero auth is an open standard authorization protocol, not just authentication, and not like SAML where it's both. This is an open standard authorization protocol. So zero auth enables a user to grant a client, the client here means a website or an application, access to the user's information at other websites without sharing the user's credentials with a client. So zero auth is designed for use with HTTP. HTTP, if you don't know, that's the language of the web. So when you go out to a web page, you're using HTTP or HTTPS, which S means secure, essentially. So zero auth provides a client secure delegated access to a user's information on behalf of the user. So an authorization server issues access tokens to a client with the approval of the user who owns the resource. So the client here is not the actual user, the client is the website itself. So client uses the access token to access a user's resources hosted by a resource server. So for example here, Google and Microsoft use zero auth to allow a user to share information about the user's account with a third-party application or website. And you may see occasionally with Google, when you try to do something like that, it'll say, hey, they have, if you go and look at your Google settings, you'll see that Google has recorded in there what type of information different services have access to. And later on, you can go in and remove those permissions if you no longer use that service or something. And this is kind of what it looks like. So an app requesting permissions using zero auth, it's going to tell you that this app would like to, and it tells you the different things here. You can accept that or you can cancel that. And often, I'm not sure about Microsoft. I haven't used Microsoft as much, but with Google, you can always go in, like I mentioned earlier, and change your access rules later on. And then we have over here different things for you to solidify your knowledge about zero auth. You go in here. Also, we have something called Identity Federation, and Identity Federation is a trust relationship that's established to exchange authentication information. So it allows a user to have a single login across multiple systems. This is really convenient. Again, I use this a lot at the state. It allowed us to just log in at one system and then use that around, in different places. So their example here is an identity federation exists between Google and Slack. Not sure if you know Slack. Slack is a nice tool for chatting and sharing files and information at work. Um, Identity federation exists between Google and Slack, a business messaging application. So a user can log into Slack with the user's Google credentials. And then we have interoperability. This is another good term that refers to the ability of different systems and organizations to communicate and collaborate. Interoperability enhances identity federation by ensuring that user credentials and security protocols are consistent across the platforms, thereby improving operational efficiency and security. So their example for this is going to be interoperability allows healthcare providers to use a single set of login credentials across multiple hospitals and clinic systems. So that streamlines your secure access. So that is it for these. The main things to keep in mind, security assertions, markup language. This is an XML-based standard. That's one of the things you'll hear about. It enables single sign-on. Others do as well. But you've got three main things here: your principal, your identity provider, and your service provider. And that does authentication and authorization. Then we get down here to OpenID. OpenID only does the decentralized authentication. It uses an OpenID identity provider and an OpenID acceptor or relying party RP. And then down, lastly, we've got zero auth, and zero auth is the open standard authorization protocol. So note this one does authorization, whereas up here we're talking about, with OpenID, we're talking about authentication, and SAML is doing both. So the ones that you see most often, I think you'll see SAML mostly in enterprises, like state of Hawaii, we used it a lot. For things like web apps, I think you'll see more OpenID and zero auth, and you probably have seen this out on the web when you're logging into services that allow you to log in through Microsoft, Google, or Facebook. So anyway, that's it for this lesson. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out. Let me know if there's any technology or anything that I glanced over that you need a little bit more information on. Please feel free to reach out and I'll get more resources for you on that. So other than that, have a great day and I'll see you in the next video. Aloha.